Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to FortneyScott's Vaccine Mandates and New Obligations for Federal Contractors and Employers. This special briefing will be recorded. I want to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's briefing will address the Emergency Temporary Standard, the 2 new executive orders, and the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force guidance. Today's presenters are FortneyScott attorneys David Fortney and Nita Beecher. I will now turn the program over to David Fortney to start our briefing.
Terrific, Valerie. Thanks so much. And Nita, it's great to see you again, even though we can't be together.
I know, it's great to see you, David, and I look forward to what is going to be a very interesting topic.
It's certainly very timely. Well, let's just jump right into it then. Next slide, Valerie. Just a note for those of you that do not know our firm, and I think most of you do, but we are a woman-owned firm. We're based here in Washington, D.C., and we do represent clients, employers, most of whom are federal contractors on a wide range of matters, including what is particularly relevant for today's discussion, safety and health and federal contracting, as well as EEO compliance, among others. So we're really glad to have this chance to chat with you a little bit about these developments. And next slide, just a preliminary housekeeping. Of course, although we are discussing a number of very recent and some very challenging legal developments, the purpose of today is to provide you with updates on those general developments. It is not to provide you with legal advice. We would counsel and encourage that you should confer with your corporate counsel for guidance to understand how these developments apply to your specific facts and circumstances and to assess your compliance. So I think with those preliminaries out of the way, Nita, we wanted to take about 30, maybe 40 minutes to talk about all these developments, and then we'll hit the chat box and try to pick up questions and comments. So why don't we jump right off with the agenda?
I'd be delighted to do that. So we're just going to go over what President Biden had to say last Thursday, basically talking about the vaccine mandate, which, to be honest, David, is a little bit of a misnomer. It's really not a mandate for most people. It's a mandate for federal employees. Then you've got the employer mandates, which we're obviously going to dig into, the OSHA emergency temporary standard, the federal contractor obligations as we understand them, and new guidance we're expecting from the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, which is a mouthful. Then we're going to conclude with what we think you all ought to be thinking about, which I'm sure you already are. And then we really do want to take your questions. We don't know all the answers, but we will give you the answers we have so far. So David, you want to kick us off with the next slide?
Sure. So let's move right into it. I mean, the president, I think everyone knows, and perhaps you saw, made a very significant public announcement last Thursday, in which he basically said, look, what we've been doing to date is not achieving we're not conquering the virus. We need more vaccine activity, including vaccine mandates in a very robust way. So let's just, for a moment, take a listen to what the president said. Now, this will play for those listening on your computers. It will play. I'm sorry for those on the phone because of the technology. I don't understand. You won't hear on the phone, but this is 10 seconds. So let's hear from the president himself.
As your president, I'm announcing tonight a new plan to require more Americans to be vaccinated to combat those blocking public health. My plan also increases testing, protects our economy, and will make our kids safer in schools. It consists of 6 broad areas of action.
There we go. We have the president calling out that he is basically turning the page from what he has tried so far. Some have said that perhaps a concession, that it didn't work. without debating that. He certainly has put forward, Nita, this six-pronged strategy. Can you talk a little bit about that for us, please?
Absolutely. And just to mention, at the end of the slides, we have some employer resources, including the actual path out of the pandemic that was issued along with President Biden's speech. It's six-pronged comprehensive national strategy is what it's called. Vaccinating the unvaccinated, that's really where we're going to spend most of our time. It really talks about the OSHA standard as well as federal contractor obligations. There's other things in here around booster shots, which is protecting the vaccinated, keeping schools open, that's having to do with masks, and protecting the vaccinated is also double fines if people don't wear masks on federal transportation like airlines. Keeping the schools open basically is masking and providing vaccinations or offering them and recommending that states and local areas mask and provide shots. Testing's a huge area where I think the country has fallen down, going to increase the testing and requiring masking as much as possible where they can. Protecting the economy because people aren't going back into restaurants. Restaurants are closing their dining rooms now because of Delta. And finally, another area where I think people feel we've fallen down is improving care for those who have COVID. There aren't a lot of options there. But we're going to focus, David, primarily on this whole area around vaccinating the unvaccinated. And so going to the next slide, you want to talk a little bit about what that encompasses? Sorry.
Sure, yeah, because really the game change here is that we're now moving to a broad-based set of mandates, and that really is the fundamental change. And the change is evident in several ways, and we're going to unpack these critical areas for you. The first is, of course, through OSHA. And this has received quite a bit of coverage in the newspaper. It's not often that the issues that we worry about day to day are literally not only front of the page, but as they say, top of the fold news reporting. But that's certainly what this proposal that OSHA issues an emergency temporary standard that would apply effectively for everyone on this call, for employers with 100 or more employees, and it would mandate vaccinations or weekly testing. And we're going to delve into that here in a moment. Accompanying this are two important brand new executive orders. The first is an executive order that addresses federal contractors. And as you will learn today, if you don't already know, the obligations that federal contractors have are in addition to those that will be included in the new OSHA emergency temporary standard. So we want to make sure that since most of you also are federal contractors, that you have the benefit of understanding those federal contractor obligations and the rather somewhat hazy way, but the kind of indirect way that we're going to go about seeing those being implemented and imposed in very near future. There's a separate executive order dealing specifically for the federal employee, the federal workforce. And in a nutshell, that executive order, which is very prescriptive, says you got to be vaccinated to come to work. It does not have the testing out option that has existed up to this point, which is you could either get vaccinated or be subject to regular testing. Now the president has said, no, it's vaccine only. Finally, Anita, I just want to touch on, because it's such an important area, both for the president's six-part plan and for our recovery and for our society, but with respect to a broad setting of healthcare settings and workers, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, as that agency is known, is very specifically dealt with. And in a nutshell, anyone that receives Medicare or Medicaid dollars now will have these vaccine mandates imposed as a condition. So this will roll up and subject to these new requirements an extremely broad segment of our society: hospital, healthcare facilities, home care providers, a wide range of medical service providers now also will be impacted and subject to the vaccine mandate. So it's pretty broad reaching, I think.
Yeah, and I think, David, one of the reasons they've done this is that the healthcare workers seem to be a group that's especially resistant. I think at least a third of healthcare workers are refusing to get vaccinated, and because there's such a shortage, some hospitals are saying, we're going to hire you, we're going to pay you more, and you don't have to be vaccinated. So to a large extent, this rule will stop that.
Correct. I was just talking to a client that was bemoaning it had its own staff that were quitting only to take jobs as traveling physicians and RNs and so forth, because they were making more money, and it really was contributing to not only the shortage of medical personnel, but also the funding challenge for it. Well, Nita, why don't we move into that OSHA ETS, as it's called, Emergency Temporary Standard. Let's start with that. That's kind of going to be the new foundation for
Correct.
most employers.
So let's talk about that. And then, David, in a few minutes, I'm going to have you explain what the Emergency Temporary Standard is for those. I know many of you do know that because we've talked about it. But anyway, here's what the President has ordered OSHA to do. They're going to issue an Emergency Temporary Standard, and according to the Solicitor of Labor, that will be within weeks, and that will require employers with 100 or more employees to ensure that their workers are either vaccinated or provided a negative test at least weekly before coming to work. All of that raises like 100,000 questions right off the top of the head. In addition, the employers will provide paid time off for their workers to get vaccinated and to recover. It says or, but it's really and to recover from any vaccine side effects. You know, some of us, I know my husband was sick for about 24 hours. We'll talk a little bit about these proposed monetary penalties. They're pretty substantial depending, and if you are found to be in violation, you can potentially have $14,000 penalties per violation per day. That would be for each person who you're not compliant with. And then finally, David, we'll talk a little bit about these state plans and how that rolls out. David, talk a little bit about what this Emergency Temporary Standard is. Not a typical regulation, and how does that roll out?
Right. So this is kind of in the tool chest that OSHA has under the statute, but it's only in very narrow, limited circumstances. So the first requirement is OSHA has to be able to identify what the statute says is a grave danger for health and safety that cannot otherwise be addressed except for implementing this new standard on an emergency basis. If you think about the COVID crisis, there's been a long-standing series of requests and even litigation challenges trying to compel OSHA to issue a general regulation. And OSHA, up to this point, had not done so because it felt that it could not meet this grave danger requirement. Indeed, earlier this year, Nita, back in, gosh, it was June 21st, the Biden administration decided that it, at that point where we were with the virus, could only meet the grave danger for healthcare workers. And they, in fact, issued at that time an emergency temporary standard, but it applied only to the healthcare sector. It wasn't broad-based, as we're talking about now. One of the attributes of an emergency temporary standard that's very different than most regulations is that we don't get to see the regulation until it's finalized and published. And when it's published, it goes into effect immediately. So this is different. It can only stay in place for up to 6 months, and we are allowed to file comments on how it's working and how it could be changed during that period. And then at the end of 6 months, OSHA has the option of converting it, amending it, modifying it, but issuing what would then be a final regulation on the books. So this ETS process that now the president has, not just said, would you please look at and consider, which is what he said earlier when he came into office. Now he has said, issue a standard. And as you reported, the solicitor said it will be done, sir, in several weeks. And she rejected, we played 20 questions. Do you mean days? No, I don't mean days. Do you mean months? No, I don't mean months. So we think weeks probably means sometime in October. that this standard will come out. The
And
only thing
I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
One thing, Nita, just because some people I know say, well, can't we file anything on this? Any comments? We will know when the emergency temporary standard is sent to the Office of Management and Budget. And there is because they have to post that under the rulemaking process. And you actually can go in and meet with OMB. And I participated in some of those efforts last time for the healthcare ETS that was issued in June. But the tricky part is you can give comments on a standard that you don't really know what it says. So you have to say, well, in the event that the standard says X, we would be concerned if it did Y, or this type of thing. So it's a little tricky, but there is that limited window, but not truly the normal comment period for rulemaking.
Right. Well, and I think, David, a couple of things that are really important for people that so far, this is what we do know. When they talk about employers and the number of employees, I think nobody on this call really has this issue, but they're going to count all your employees. So it's just like EEO1. If you have 100 employees anywhere in the U.S., you're going to be covered. We do not know, to be perfectly honest. There are a lot of questions around collecting the data on vaccinations or how the negative tests are going to be, who's going to do the test, how they're going to be done. And for both the vaccinations and the tests, those are considered to be medical records according to the EEOC. So employers will have to protect them like medical records. I think an important point here is that employers will be required to provide paid time off for people to get vaccines or to recover from the side effects. Not clear whether they're required to pay people who go get tests, because that is a mandate and it's unclear at this point. Although, David, did you want to mention the FLSA guidance?
Right. Earlier this year, the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division published some questions and answers addressing whether people that are required to take tests are subject to being paid. This is per the Fair Labor Standards Act, so the federal law. And the answer was generally, is a little bit caveated, but generally the answer appears to be yes, from what the wage hour said in its guidance. Whether that will hold true here, that is whether those that are being tested because they're not vaccinated will have to be compensated, remains to be sorted out and determined. And Nita, you did mention, but I want to underscore, state law is very, very important, because under many state laws, the answer is not ambiguous. You will need to pay employees for the time spent on testing. Then I might add that the whole range of what's posed here, what tests are going to be accepted? How are the test results going to be transmitted? Are we going to use these take-home tests? Are we going to send people to the pharmacies and have testing done? Are we going to do testing on site? There's just so much we don't know. Vaccine passports, which the administration previously said, no, we don't want. Well, what is proof of a vaccine? Is it the card that maybe you bought on the internet for $20? Is it a picture on your phone? What is that? And then, as Nita mentioned, the record keeping, the devil will be in the detail on that, because they are potentially medical records and subject to it, and also may be subject to OSHA record keeping. So these details, we can identify the questions. What we do know are the broad outlines that we've given you here, and we're going to know more soon in about 2 weeks, but we don't have 2 to 3 weeks, but we don't have it all today.
David, I did want to mention Friday afternoon, we did listen to a DOL webinar that they provided, about 30 minutes of discussion. And they did mention in that webinar that as part of the ETS, they will be providing the instructions on how the vaccine verification process will be set up, and also what the testing procedures are, because that is really something employers are going to need to know, exactly how to comply.
One other thing that they did reference, that is the senior career staff on Friday, indicated that for an individual who works exclusively from home, that is, they do not go in contact with their coworkers or with others, they work exclusively from home, that they likely would fall outside of this ETS. but any worker who comes in contact with other workers or is likely to, or travels, or has interface with others, we believe is likely going to be subject to this emergency temporary standard. So when we say all workers, I think it's with that slight tweak,
Right.
perhaps, but it will certainly be the lion's share of workers.
One last thing, David, would you talk a little bit about the OSHA state plans and how that might play into this just briefly?
Sure, be happy to, Nita. So the OSHA, there are 22 states that have what are referred to as state plans. And under the federal OSHA scheme, each state has the opportunity or the option, do I want to follow the federal OSHA requirements, or do we want to have our own state requirements? The states are permitted to do that, provided that the scheme that they put in place is at least as protective as the federal standards, or they can simply adopt the federal standards, but they can't do anything less. It's kind of like the federal minimum wage. Many states have higher minimum wages, but you can't impose something lower. In this case, there are 22 states, and again, in our resources at the end of the PowerPoint deck, we've got a website that you can go to. It's the OSHA website, where you can see those 22 states. For those 22 states, they will have 30 days after OSHA publishes the ETS, in which the state can either adopt its own vaccination ETS or indicate it will follow the federal ETS. So when this goes into effect, it will go into effect for all federal OSHA states, and then for those 22 states, for the next 30 days, we will be monitoring and see when those come into compliance. All right.
Well, David, with all that, let's see what President Biden had to say to federal contractors.
Sure. As they say, let's go to the videotape and hear what the president said, because he addressed contractors specifically. So, Mr. President.
I've signed another executive order that will require federal contractors to do the same. If you want to work with the federal government and do business with us, get vaccinated. If you want to do business with the federal government, vaccinate your workforce.
There you go. You want to do business with the federal government, vaccinate your workforce. So saith the president. That certainly caught everyone's attention. And as we indicated, he has signed an executive order that addresses that. And the new executive order, and again, they're in our resource page, so you can link to them and read them for yourself. But importantly, it talks about that the new COVID safeguards need to apply to all workers performing on or in connection with a federal contract. On or in connection with. So it does not literally say every one of your employees, if you're a federal contractor. It says those that are performing on or in connection with. Many of you have had part of your workforce that have been on site, that is at federal locations, since midsummer, when the president and the administration imposed a requirement for those employees coming on site. They either had to be vaccinated or show a test, at least a weekly test. Now the obligation is broadened to a broader segment of your workforce, not just those on site, but anyone performing on or in connection with the federal contract, irrespective of the work location. It's not just those that are on site. Second, which contracts? The contracts are, and they're spelled out for you there, but basically it's services, construction, leasehold interests for real property, other services covered by the Service Contract Act. It's fairly broad. Note that the executive order does include some exceptions, meaning certain government contracts are carved out of these new requirements. And those carve-outs are specifically for either recipients of grants, you're not subject to these requirements, or other example would be contracts that are solely for products, not products and services. So if you sell widgets alone, you may be within the product carve out. But if you do installation work relating to the widgets you sell or other services, you may be covered. So that needs to be looked at very carefully, depending on what business you're in and what type of contracts your company holds, to make sure that you, in fact, are subject to the mandate. I think most of you are going to find you will be. And yeah, Nita.
Just to give everybody an idea of this performing on or in connection with a federal contract, we see that language in some of the more recent federal contract obligations, paid sick leave, minimum wage, and there is a definition in there that there is a minimum standard. So basically, you're covered if you spend at least 20% of your time doing government contracts work. So that would include back office people who issue bills or do accounting or whatever, in addition to those direct charge employees that, you would expect to be covered. We haven't gotten that standard yet, but that's what we've seen used in other contexts.
Right, because as you point out, the minimum wage, and that regulation was promulgated by the Biden administration this summer, used that 20% test, as did paid sick leave. So we'll see very soon on what specifically is going to be there. But that in connection with is a little hook that we need to make sure we understand. Candidly, many contractors say, I can't figure out who does 20%, 18%, 25%. We're going to put everyone under this standard. And many, just for administrative convenience, have adopted that approach with respect to other programs, paid sick leave, I'm thinking particularly. Well, Nita, let's talk about the other point, which is the scoping. We've talked about which workers and which contracts. Let's talk about some of the mechanics, because this is a contract program. So on the next slide, Valerie, let's look a little bit about how the contract program gets introduced. Because as I think most of you know, in order to impose a new obligation on a contractor, it has to become part of your contract. And the executive order lays out in fair amount of detail how these new contract clauses providing for the COVID safety protocols are going to be introduced. And basically, it says that there's a series of steps. The new clause is going to be developed by the FAR Council, and it will be ready to be included in all new contract instruments by October 15. So that's in roughly 1 month. And the new clause is going to require all contractors and all tiers of subcontractors to comply with all the guidance for workplace locations that are published. And we're going to talk about this task force requirement here in a moment. It also, those of you who are very familiar with so-called flow down clauses, that is not only clauses that you will receive in your contract that bind you, but that when you turn around and wheel out subcontracts for the performance of the contract, you will have to include these clauses, and your subcontractors, as well as their subcontractors, et cetera, will all be bound by that. Now, many of you today have a large inventory of current contracts, and perhaps they're not going subject for renewal or new purchase orders. What's going to happen to those? Well, the executive order addresses that, and the words it uses is strongly encourage. The executive order strongly encourages the procurement agencies, those are your customers, the Defense Department, any federal agency you're dealing with, all those contracting officials that you deal with have been directly, strongly encouraged by the president's executive order to add these safety protocols in your existing contracts. Maybe it's through a purchase order. Maybe it's proposing, hey, will you agree that we can simply amend this contract to now add these requirements to it? There are a host of specific obligations in that regard. So your contracting officials need to absolutely immediately be made aware of these developments, be trained to report back. I would suggest to legal counsel to understand what and how you want to respond as a company to the proposals and whether you're going to agree and include them and how they will be implemented. And I might add, for those of you can also think about whether you're entitled to contract adjustments for any additional cost to perform the contract. sometimes there are ways of securing those adjustments too if you take on new contracting obligations. So all the mechanics of the contract clauses, how they're added to new contracts, existing contracts, purchase orders, solicitations. Bottom line, we would like to see your contracting officials, your compliance and procurement arms be very ramped up on these new requirements and made aware of this so that they're on the lookout and you can coordinate and respond. Nita.
David, there's one other thing I wanted to point out because I had a question came from through the Institute on this. In addition to it applying to, as we mentioned earlier, workers performing on or in connection with, it's also locations, workplace locations in which an individual is working on or in connection with. So it is, you know, because initially the July requirements were basically on-site employees. This is going to be anybody you have other than, it appears like we were talking about OSHA, it appears that those people who are not, who are working from home solely and not interacting with others may not be covered. The other thing I wanted to mention is we have mandate on the.
Excuse me, Nita,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
This question of whether you work, if you work exclusively from home, could you be covered? That's going to be sorted out when we get this
Correct.
upcoming guidance, because the executive order notes the clause shall apply to any workplace location as specified by the task force guidance.
Okay.
So
well, we should go to that slide.
It's possible that people, it could even pick up the people working from home, and that would
Correct.
be very different, because the OSHA one we know is not, but this could pick those up. So what is all this guidance, Nita? We keep talking about it. Let's unpack that a little bit.
Well, I think the important thing is to know that the Safer Workforce Task Force, which just for convenience we're going to call the task force, was established on January 20th. And it was established by an executive order signed by the president called Protecting the Federal Workforce. And they have published model agency safety principles. They've got a model certification that employees can sign. They did all of this before President Biden came out with his last requirement of testing or vaccination. So they are now being directed by this executive order, which, as you pointed out, doesn't have a mandate in it, but the executive order is directing them to provide additional guidance. And we believe it will include a vaccine mandate for federal contractor workers. The question being how broad, back to David's point, will it cover every single place a federal contractor employee worker is working, if they are working on a contract of any kind, even if it's at home. There will be exemptions based on religion and disability, and so that is going to be what those who don't wish to get a vaccine, I expect you're going to get a huge influx of claims of religious and maybe disability requirements there. So that is to be published according to the executive order on September 24th, which is less than 2 weeks from now. And it's supposed to give us all this information.
Right. So this, everyone says, well, what specifically? You know, is the testing off the table? Is it going to be vaccine only? We don't know for the federal contractor workforce. From some of the comments that the president has made and some of the communications from the White House, it appears it's going in that direction. So that would be very different than OSHA, which gives you a testing option. You can, if you will, test out of getting a vaccination. But federal employees, we know, do not have that option, that is
Correct.
testing out. They must be vaccinated. And with respect to those contractor workers, and note we consistently have been using the term worker because that's broader and includes both your employees and your independent contractors. So federal contractor workers, whether they're going to be following the federal employee model, that is vaccination only, unless you have an exemption, or the OSHA model, we're not sure. My bet is that the federal contractor world is going to tilt and follow the federal employee model, and it will be vaccination only. But we don't know that yet. Nita.
One thing about OSHA, David, that you've talked about in the past is they don't, there's some question about how far they could really push their regulation outside the workplace. And so, but federal contractors, clearly, you know, the president can tell them, and he did tell them, this is what we're going to require. So, you know, it could be almost all federal contractor workers who touch a federal contract are going to be covered.
Right, as long as they're working on, or, you know, again,
in connection with,
and at least spend 20% of their time doing federal contract work. So we'll see. We're going to know the answer on this in less than 2 weeks. But clearly, my bet would be that we're going to see no test out option, that it's going to be vaccinations only. It just feels like it's moving in that direction. Well, Nita, let's anything else you want to talk about on the task force, or do you want to jump into what you think folks should be doing?
We're going to jump into this. I'm just going to make one. I'm sorry, I was just going to make one last comment. Is the guidance is already there. I think for the task force to move forward, they simply take the testing part out of the guidance they already have, and I think they're ready to go. But go ahead, David. How do we kick this off here?
Well, so what we wanted to leave you with just some final thoughts on, okay, we have these developments in hand. What do you do now? Because we've made the point, we don't have contract clauses. We don't have the details from the task force. They're going to have in 2 weeks. Should we just wait and get the details? No, we think that there's a whole range of things that you should begin immediately. And we have a number of clients that took that advice to heart. And as of last Friday, they were beginning immediately. And I expect many of you have also. The first thing I think is to begin to think through communication strategies. You have a wide range of stakeholders, very important ones, particularly with the worker shortage that many people are facing. Getting some even though you may not know all the details, but getting communications ready now that you will be able to roll out, because there's a growing number of anxiety. I certainly see it on the social media sites of people saying, oh man, if I got to be vaccinated, I'm going to quit, or I don't think they'll make me get vaccinated, or something. Maybe, and we have some clients that are beginning to generate some baseline communications now. The president's made a general announcement. We're looking at this. The details aren't due to be published until, you know, September 24th, and we'll have more information for you as soon as that information becomes available to us and what this means for our company. That type of communication strategy, I think, is very, very valuable. And also how you push that out, whether you have people working currently in person, whether you've got people virtually, whether you have regular staff meetings, or there's a special communication designed for this.
And David, I think the next thing is, even though we know OSHA is probably going to provide protocols for vaccination and testing, I think employers need to start thinking about it for their own self. And especially they need to think about what are the state and local requirements. We have 2 states, Montana and North Dakota, that do not allow employers to require tests, to require vaccines. So testing is still available, but they don't allow them to require vaccines, and it's a little unclear whether or not OSHA will override that at this point. Obviously, the federal contractor obligations, I believe, would override that, but at least you need to know where those are. What are your issues?
And if you're in those states, OSHA has limited preemption. If there's a specific state statute that conflicts with the federal OSHA regulation, a state statute governing workplace safety and health, it likely would be preempted. But some of these other broader statutes of broader application may not be. There's Supreme Court precedent on that, and depending on where you operate, you may have those issues. Let me underscore, those states that have more protective provisions in place, you must continue to meet all of those requirements. So again, these are federal floors we're talking about, and you are not excused from more demanding state requirements that offer greater protections. So that's why we refer to this as a matrix, because many of our clients have federal, state, and often local requirements to deal with. And so you got to thread that needle.
Well, and I think you ought to at least start thinking about what kind of a process would work for you as far as verifying vaccination status and record keeping, because you are going to have to treat it like a medical record. How would you do that? And we'll just start thinking about that before so you know what might work for you.
Right. What are your record keeping obligations, both in duration, who has access to those records, how they're updated? We all know that vaccinations apparently expire at a certain period of time. So what do we do when people are vaccinated, but then they expire, or their vaccination status lapses, and how we communicate and deal with that? Those are all details. We don't fully have the answers, but beginning to map through how we're going to do that and communicate with people about that, what we're going to accept as proof of vaccination. Is it a photograph of a card? Is it showing the card? Do we want to keep the card? Do we want a certification? There's a lot of options that people are looking at.
Well, and I think we talked about this already. Is the time required for the testing going to be compensable? And that's really a state and federal question. In addition to, if there isn't clear from state and federal guidance, what would you as an employer do about that? Because it's going to be done, you have to do it weekly in some way, shape, or form for those people who can't or won't get the vaccine.
Right. And certainly the testing processes and payment, that is going to be detailed in the ETS. But understanding what options are available. So when that ETS standard issues, we can very quickly map on to what we know is available and select and make sure they have the capacity, the bandwidth that we need for the workforce that we have to deal with.
And I think we talked a little bit about the reasonable accommodation process. You need to get that up and running, have something very consistent. You have to have the interactive process for both religious and disability discrimination or accommodation requirements, and you want to document that completely. And finally, David, as he
Collective
takes
bargaining.
a sip of.
No, that's fine. Collective bargaining. Review your current CBAs. Make an assessment. I mean, you know what's about to come down. Do we need to bargain? Is it mandatory? Likely. Depends on your management rights clause. Do you want to start informal meet and confer opportunities with the union today? Up to you. Some are doing just that in order that this can be streamlined and get out smoothly. All right. Well, a lot there. Let's just go and share with you a final thought. Nita, do you want to just walk through these are kind of the key dates?
Sure.
From our standpoint that we're kind of got on our calendar to help you get out of the weeds a little bit under big picture so you can monitor what's going forward. Yeah.
Okay, today is September 13th. September 24th, the task force guidance is supposed to issue, and it's going to tell you specifically what you have to do if you're a federal contractor and which of your employees will be covered. Expect that, you're going to have a fair number, many more than were covered originally. The FAR Council is going to issue their policy directions on October the 8th. The effective date for new contracts is going to be October 15th for this new provision. And we don't know exactly when the ETS will be published. We expect it to be published before the end of October.
So that's our best guess. Those are the dates that we have logged. We're anticipating reconvening with everyone shortly after September 24th, assuming that the guidance is issued as scheduled, and I think it will be. Give us a couple days to unpack it, and then we'll pull it back together and I think be able to fill in a lot of the detail with respect to what federal contractors are going to be expected to undertake. So I think that's going to be a really important point. I want to check our chat box because we do have a few minutes, and I do want to afford people a chance if there are questions or comments.
David, while you're doing that, let me just, we had seen some stuff in the press that they were going to give federal workers, I think it was 74 days, I'm sorry, I'm looking for it, 75 days to comply, and that is not in any of the executive orders. That came from Jen Pataki, who made that comment. So, and I do think we have a comment in the comment box, David.
And that would be, she is the press secretary, the White House press
She
secretary.
is the press secretary.
Right. So presumably she knows something. So what is our comment, Nita? Can you read that? I'm yanking it up.
Yes, hold on. Let's see, hold on, let me go, I see it. All right, we have not previously required disclosure of vaccine status. As a result, we do not have a sense how impactful these requirements might be. Are we within our right to request disclosure at this point? If so, would that be a mandatory disclosure or a voluntary disclosure?
Great question.
Yeah, these are the fun ones.
I actually do think that you have the right, and the EEOC has said that we do have the right. I mean, if we have the right to impose vaccines, and we do, you also have the right to determine who is or is not vaccinated. And I'm putting
Correct.
aside these kind of outlier state law questions. I'm saying generally as a matter of federal law. So yes, you do have the right to inquire as to whether people are currently, and I would use the term fully vaccinated.
Correct.
Okay, as the term, and you may want to flesh out what that means. Number two, in terms of can you disclose it at this point? Could you require it to be disclosed at this point? I think yes.
Absolutely.
And because I think that, and this goes back to the reason we led with the communication strategy. I think the communication that would surround that ask would be very important. The president has announced that we as a federal contractor and through OSHA requirements are going to be subject to a number of new vaccine mandates. In order for us to prepare for the detailed requirements that are going to be published in the near future, it is important for us to understand which members of our team currently are vaccinated. And then you might provide a mechanism, again, with keeping in mind that these are not a reply all and not, handled appropriately. Maybe people, just like they do to update their individual personnel file, can come onto a site and click a certification. Maybe you decide that you want some proof of that, whether you want that from a record keeping or not. There are different ways you can go about that. But I think that it's actually not a bad idea, because you're basically saying, how deep in the hole are we going to be, assuming that they impose
Right.
mandates? Are we 30% there or 80% there?
Yeah, David,
Good
let me
question.
just say one other thing is they are going to tell us for OSHA purposes what is necessary to prove vaccination, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't go ahead and start doing that. Just remember that the answers you get will be protected as a medical record. We have another question, Mr. Fortney. Do you expect there to be a carve-out for portions of a federal contractor that do not support federal contracts, similar to the separate facility exemption? This would be under the workers performing, under a government contract.
Well, I don't know if it'd be by site. I think it's more by workers. That may correspond to a site,
Right.
or may not. But remember, they either have to be performing work on the contract or in connection with, and that's where that 20% test comes up. Because a lot of people have workers that do both commercial work as well as federal contract work.
Correct.
And it may depend on what they're doing, what day, what week, et cetera. So that I think is going to be the only carve out. I don't think it's going to be necessarily a site, but you'll look at your workforce and how you lay out your work and who does the work. I would say in the past, we've had some clients, because of these types of requirements, that have actually repositioned work and consolidated work, kind of siloed work, and had workers that only did the federal contract work. So they'd be
Correct.
subject to the prevailing wage and all these other stepped up requirements. And then they kept the non-contract, the commercial folks, completely separate. That's for OFCCP, they all potentially are covered, but for these sorts of add-on requirements, you at least could wall off some in that manner, I think.
And when I worked for McDonnell Douglas, they definitely did that. They had the sections that were federal contractors separate from Douglas Aircraft.
Right.
Basically.
Okay. Others.
Let's see. I don't see any more from the group, but I know there are a lot of, what the president said and what is actually in the executive order, I think, is very confusing to a lot of people, David. I think that the fact that there's been a number of questions that have been sent to the Department of Labor, I think most of which we've had questions about, but there's one that I thought was interesting. Oh, here we got another question from this group. Here we go. Let me see. Hold on one second. I'm scrolling down. What type of legal challenges do you anticipate, Mr. Fortney? Legal challenges.
Yeah.
Lots.
Okay. Pause. There'll be a question on arguing that the state laws still stand, that is, that the OSHA cannot set them aside. There will be some state plan states that will refuse to enact ETS, I believe, or enact an ETS that is comparable to this. That already occurred on a smaller scale with respect to the healthcare workers. The great Palmetto State basically said, no thanks, we don't want that. And it really proves what an imprecise tool there is to respond to that. I think that most of the litigation action is initially going to be focused on OSHA. You've heard the governors of different states promising that they will file action. I think they will. It's cheap to file a lawsuit, relatively speaking, and easy, but they need to first wait until OSHA issues the standard. So that's the reason you haven't seen a lawsuit today or over the weekend. The emergency temporary standard needs to issue, but I expect within 24 hours there will be. Likely, if I were picking the forum, I'd do it in the Eastern District of Texas. I would run it up through the Fifth Circuit and see what the Supreme Court had to say. In the meantime, unless it's enjoined, the standard will continue to have to be followed.
Yeah. So just a follow up to the earlier question, those people who have over 100 employees or 100 or more employees, they'd still be covered by the OSHA ETS, even if they're not covered by the federal contractor.
Correct. Anyone with 100 or more employees, US, you're subject to the OSHA requirement.
Okay. The 20% we discussed, David, do you remember whether it's day, week, or year? I don't remember.
Well, in the other programs, it's not defined in quite that way. It's over a reasonable period of time. It's certainly not by day or week. It's typically longer periods of time, sometimes quarters, sometimes annually. But that's again, that's a very important question that I'm hoping will be addressed in 2 weeks by the task force.
Well, hopefully we can get some FAQs from Wage and Hour, or whoever is going to be from OSHA to say if that's the standard. From somebody to say that's the standard, whether it's from the task force or whomever. We'll just have to wait and see. Here's another interesting question. I have an employee who is saying that their doctor has told them they can't get vaccinated for 90 days because they currently have COVID. I can't find anything on the CDC pertaining to this. And if there is a 75-day requirement, do you have any idea how this might be addressed? And this is related to another question I had that somebody asked, which is, will workers who had the virus, still have to be vaccinated and get tested?
Right. The short answer is we don't know for sure. I expect they're going to try to accommodate that if there's a temporary period of time for whatever the medical reason may be, that one cannot receive a vaccine, that once you are no longer subject to that medical restriction, you then would be expected within a reasonable period of time to become vaccinated. But that's kind of informed speculation. I can't point to a standard that says that, but I think that's the direction it kind of feels like we're likely to go on that.
And if it's the OSHA standard, they simply, they don't have to be vaccinated; they just have to be tested.
Correct.
If that's a problem.
They would not be. That's right. They could test if they were medically ineligible for being vaccinated. They still, under OSHA, would be tested at least weekly. At least weekly is the way they've worded it.
I have one more for you. How will these changes be implemented at public institutions of higher education?
Yeah. So this deals with the kind of delicate interplay of. So let's keep in mind a lot of institutions of higher education have both grants and contracts. So first, make sure that you have a government contract. and not a grant. That is a contract that triggers these requirements. OSHA, depending on your if you're a state university or not, the state plan will kick in, but generally the OSHA standards do apply at most institutions of higher ed. So I think the discussions we've had on OSHA at a minimum will flow through and apply. With respect to contracts, not grants, if you in fact do have contracts at higher ed, you're going to be treated just like all the other contractors. You're not going to get any special, at least that they've identified yet, no carve-outs, no waivers. In fact, the president, the White House, points to higher ed's efforts to impose vaccine mandates as one of the indicators of why his policy should be more broadly followed. I'm thinking particularly the litigation which the Indiana University successfully upheld its mandate through the Seventh Circuit, and the Supreme Court did not touch that. So the courts have actually been, just on an ending point here, the courts have actually been quite supportive of the mandates. They have not given much heed to these private actions to try to set mandates aside. They've supported higher ed with their mandates. They smacked down the challenge to mandates that Houston Medical put in. And so we'll see, but so far at least the mandates, that's why I think the president has said, look, if you want to bring litigation, bring it on, because he probably feels he's got the stronger position on most of the challenges.
The only place I think, and that's what employers need to be careful about, religion is an area where the court especially has been very sensitive, and they have lifted mandates that they felt were too burdensome on religion. So that means that when you get these religious requests, which you're going to get a ton of them, that you have to take them seriously and handle them in a way that is not going to blow back on you.
Exactly. Well, Nita, let's just, Valerie, let's just show the other slide. So anyone that wants a copy of this deck, Valerie will tell you how to get it, but let's go to the next slide. We've got a couple of pages of resources. So almost everything we've referred to here, if you want the deck,
keep clicking through this.
You've got a link, can take you right to these. These are the executive orders, EEOC guidance we've talked about, OSHA, those are the state plan states. Next slide, please. The 22 states, you can get a list of what those states are. That guidance that we referenced under the FLSA on whether testing is compensable. The answer there seems to be yes, but you should take a look at that. So I think those are all useful. We talked about what you're doing now. That's your homework between now and September 24th. Read everything on that list, and we'll check back in. All right. Well, Nita, I want to thank you. This has been a fun and rapid trip on a really, this is less than 2 days old, these developments. So
That's
we really,
crazy.
Yeah, but we appreciate everyone joining us. And Valerie, we'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
We would like to thank you for joining us. You will receive a survey requesting feedback for today's presentation. You are able to submit suggestions for future topics through the survey. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, and of course, if you would like a copy of the slides, please email info@FortneyScott.com. Also, please subscribe and listen to our new DC Insider Employer Update podcast, which you can find on FortneyScott.com or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.